Snow was gone by then. The last week of March in the main river valley smells like river mud and pine, and on the morning of March 29, 1945, a lieutenant named Heymann was walked out of a cellar in the middle of Aschaffenburg, marched to a lamppost in front of a café on the Herstalstrasse, and hanged in full view of anyone who happened to be on the street. A cardboard sign was tied around his neck. The sign said he was a coward. The man who gave the order was a 40-something former schoolteacher from a small town in the Palatinate. He was a major, not a general, not an SS officer, not one of the names you'd know from a documentary. A major, a World War I veteran who kept his reserve commission through 20 peacetime years of teaching schoolchildren, and who, by the last week of March 1945, had convinced himself that the city of Aschaffenburg, 70,000 people, medieval castle on the river, was going to be held to the last man. His name was Emil Lamberth. And what he did in the 9 days between March 25th and April 3rd of 1945 killed 70% of a city that had already lost the war. If you care about the corners of this war that never made it into the textbooks, subscribe. This is one of them. Let me back up. By late March of 1945, the American 7th Army under Alexander Patch and elements of Patton's 3rd Army had crossed the Rhine and were driving east into the German heartland. The war, from any professional military standpoint, was over. The Wehrmacht's own operational command knew it. Berlin knew it. The generals in the field were, quietly, in many places, letting cities be handed over without a fight to spare the civilian population what everyone could see coming. Aschaffenburg was supposed to be one of those cities. It sat on the Main River about 40 miles southeast of Frankfurt, a place most Americans in 1945 couldn't have found on a map, and most Americans today still can't. It had a castle called Schloss Johannisburg, red sandstone, 4 towers, one of the finest Renaissance buildings in Germany. It had a population of civilians, wounded soldiers in convalescent barracks, and a garrison of maybe 8,500 men, most of them Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and walking wounded infantry pulled off hospital beds and handed rifles. It also had Emil Lamberth, and on March 5, 1945, Lamberth had done something that his fellow reserve officers found strange. He had sworn a personal oath, not to Germany, not to the army, but to Adolf Hitler by name, placing himself and the defense of Aschaffenburg under Hitler's direct command. 20 days later, the Americans arrived. The lead element was the 4th Armored Division, coming up hard from the west, after Patton's rapid drive across central Germany. They took the railroad bridge intact on March 25th, Palm Sunday, before the German engineers could blow it. Lamberth got the news at 9 o'clock that morning. By evening, the road bridge was down, and the Americans were across the Main. Then came the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, National Guard men from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona, veterans of Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, southern France, men who had been fighting since 1943 and thought they had seen every kind of resistance the Wehrmacht could produce. Their 157th Regiment took over the Aschaffenburg sector from the Armour, and the 3rd Battalion of that regiment was commanded by a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel from Arizona named Felix Sparks. Remember that name, Felix Sparks. 2 weeks after Aschaffenburg, Sparks would be the American officer who walked into Dachau. But that's a different story for a different day. On March 27th, Sparks's battalion started crossing the Main. What they expected was a routine mop-up of a beaten city. What they walked into was 9 days of house-to-house fighting so brutal that the Warfare History Network later called it one of the last true urban battles of the European War, because Lamberth had made a decision. He had decided the city would not surrender. And when men under his command tried to disagree, he made examples of them. The first example was a lieutenant named Heymann. The record on Heymann is thin but consistent across sources. He was a convalescent officer, meaning he was recovering from wounds in one of the Aschaffenburg military hospitals when the fighting started. On March 26th, he was ordered to report to the local command for reassignment to the defense. He did not report. Later that day, he was arrested, accused of desertion, and additionally accused of having drawn or possessed an English-language sign found hidden in a basement, which the prosecution took to mean he was preparing to surrender to the Americans. Lamberth convened a court-martial. It was a fast proceeding. According to Lamberth's own post-war testimony, Heymann offered no defense. Lamberth took that silence as an admission of guilt. On March 29th, 4 days into the battle, Heymann was walked out into the street and hanged from a lamppost in front of a cafe. His body was left there. So was the sign. He was not the only one. A Luftwaffe man who told his superiors he had no combat skills to contribute was also executed. American troops and war correspondents entering the city later reported seeing multiple bodies hanging from lampposts along the main streets. The exact number was never established. 2 are documented by name. Others are documented by eyewitness account. The message was for the living: keep fighting. Because if you stop, this is what stops you. And it worked. That's the part that's hard to sit with. For 9 days, in a city everyone knew was lost, in a war everyone knew was over, Lamberth's mixed bag of walking wounded and teenage Volkssturm and hospital cases kept the Thunderbirds fighting street by street, building by building, cellar by cellar. The Americans brought in P-47 Thunderbolts. They flattened blocks. They brought in artillery and dropped it on churches and schools and apartment houses that had civilians still huddled in the basements. Because that was the price Lamberth had set, and the Americans had to pay it if they wanted the city. On March 30th, German frogmen came down the main river in the dark, trying to blow the American bridgehead. They failed. On March 31st, the encirclement tightened. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, the ring closed completely. The city was cut off. Anyone with eyes could see it was over. Lamberth kept fighting. There's a question historians still argue about, and I want to be honest with you about it before we go any further. Was Lamberth an ardent Nazi, a true believer who wanted to bleed the Americans for every foot of ground? Or was he a broken schoolteacher under the thumb of SS overseers and Nazi party officials who were the real fanatics? And Lamberth was doing what a lot of German officers were doing in the last weeks of the war, which was surviving the wrong people watching him. The Americans who fought him had one answer: he was a fanatic. Full stop. The Germans who served under him and Lamberth himself in his 1949 trial told a different story. They said the SS and Nazi party men in the city were constantly interfering, that Lamberth had less control than the Americans thought, that a 1949 Aschaffenburg newspaper article stated Lamberth had been drunk when he condemned Heymann. Not an excuse, not a defense, but not the picture of a cold ideologue either. The truth is probably somewhere in that middle space where a lot of Germans of that generation ended up. A man who took an oath he couldn't back out of, in a system that would have hanged him from his own lamppost if he'd tried, and who kept doing what the system required until American infantry with grenades and flamethrowers made it impossible to continue. By April 2nd, it was impossible. At 7 o'clock that morning, Lamberth sent an emissary, a Volkssturm officer with a captured American in tow, to seek surrender terms. Colonel O'Brien, commanding the 157th, refused to negotiate. He gave Lamberth 1 hour. Surrender by 8, unconditionally, or the artillery and the air and the infantry come in and finish it. Lamberth agreed, but he added one condition. He would not surrender personally to any officer of rank lower than his own. He was a major. He wanted a major or above to accept the surrender. O'Brien sent Felix Sparks. Sparks was a lieutenant colonel, a rank above, and he happened to be a few blocks from the Schloss Johannisburg, where Lamberth had set up his final command post. Sparks drove up in a jeep. He got out. He walked into the castle. He found Lamberth and told him, in the flat matter-of-fact voice, of an Arizona National Guard officer who had been fighting since Sicily, that he was a colonel, and Lamberth was going to surrender to him now. Lamberth gave the order. His officers came out of the building single file. They unbuckled their pistol belts and dropped them at Sparks's feet. At 9 o'clock in the morning on April 3rd, 1945, white flags went up from the damaged towers of the Schloss Johannisburg. The battle was over. Here's the ledger. 70% of Aschaffenburg was destroyed. Of the 8,500 German defenders, 1,600 were killed or wounded, 3,500 were taken prisoner. American casualties came to roughly 3,000 killed, wounded, and missing across the whole operation, with the 45th Division absorbing the worst of it. Civilian dead were counted in the several hundreds and were never fully tallied. 4 days after the surrender, on April 7, 1945, Secretary of War Henry Stimson stood in front of the American press in Washington. He was 77 years old. He had been Secretary of War under William Howard Taft 35 years before this moment, and he was Secretary of War again now, watching a war end. He read a statement about Aschaffenburg. He said, quote, "There is a lesson with respect to what happened in Aschaffenburg. Their Nazi fanatics used the visible threat of 2 hangings to compel German soldiers and civilians to fight for a week. 2 hangings. That's how the Secretary of War of the United States, on the record, on April 7, 1945, described what Emil Lamberth had done. 2 hangings had bought Nazi Germany 1 more week of a war that had already killed something on the order of 60 million people worldwide. And the American press wrote it down, and the country read it over breakfast. And then the news cycle moved on to the next town and the next atrocity, and Aschaffenburg was forgotten almost before the rubble stopped smoking. If you're finding this useful, share it with someone who cares about the parts of the war that never made the History Channel. That's how these stories stay alive. Now Lamberth. He surrendered to Sparks at Schloss Johannisburg on April 3rd. He went into American captivity. He was held for years while the Allies processed the enormous backlog of German officers with cases pending. In 1949, he was tried by a German court under post-war civilian jurisdiction for manslaughter in the death of Lieutenant Heymann. At his trial, Lamberth said Heymann had offered no defense at the original court-martial, and that this silence was what convinced him of Heymann's guilt. The 1949 court found this reasoning insufficient. It found Lamberth guilty of manslaughter. It sentenced him to 4 years in prison. The sentence was then reduced. The court accepted, in mitigation, that Lamberth had been operating under the pressure of SS and Nazi party officials who had made surrender impossible and who might well have killed him for attempting it. He served a fraction of the 4 years and was released. He went back to civilian life. The schoolteacher, who had sworn an oath to Hitler on March 5, 1945, and hanged a wounded lieutenant from a lamppost 24 days later, lived out the rest of his life quietly. Heymann has no lamppost anymore. That lamppost is gone. The cafe is gone. The building it stood in front of is gone, replaced by post-war reconstruction that swept away most of what the Americans hadn't already flattened. If you walk down the Herstallstrasse in Aschaffenburg today, you will not find a plaque. You will not find a marker. There is no monument. What there is a city, rebuilt, full of people who go to work and drink beer at the outdoor cafes in summer and don't spend a lot of time thinking about what happened on their street in the last week of March 1945. And there is Felix Sparks. Sparks came home to Colorado. He went to law school. He became a brigadier general in the Colorado National Guard, then a justice on the Colorado Supreme Court. He spent the rest of his life talking, when he was asked, about what he had seen at Dachau. He rarely talked about Aschaffenburg. When he died in 2007, the New York Times obituary mentioned it in 1 sentence, and there is a schoolteacher who kept his reserve commission and a lieutenant named Heymann who never got the chance to explain himself, and a sign around a dead man's neck, and a city that paid 70% of itself so that Adolf Hitler, 1,000 miles away in a bunker in Berlin, could have 1 more week. That's the story of Aschaffenburg. It doesn't have a hero. It doesn't have a clean ending. It has a receipt. The receipt is a city.